At the age when most people are still trying to understand who they are, one man had already decided to change the world. By the time he was 30 years old, he had conquered more land than any human being before him. He never lost a battle, not once. His army marched from the mountains of Greece, across Egypt, through Persia, and all the way to the edge of India. And then, at the height of his power, he died. Suddenly, unexpectedly, without an heir. This is the story of Alexander the Great, not just the conqueror, but the man. To understand Alexander, you must first understand the scale of what he attempted. In just 11 years, he dismantled the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Persian Empire, a superpower that ruled over millions of people, with vast armies, endless resources, and centuries of dominance. Alexander destroyed it with an army that was often outnumbered, far from home, and constantly on the brink of exhaustion. How? That question has haunted historians for over 2,000 years. Alexander was not born into a peaceful world. He was born into violence, ambition, and power. His homeland, Macedon, was considered a rough and dangerous kingdom by the refined city-states of Greece. Yet from this overlooked land emerged a young prince who would grow up believing that ordinary limits did not apply to him. From childhood, Alexander was told he was destined for greatness, that his bloodline traced back to heroes, that the gods themselves watched over him. And when a child is raised to believe that the world exists to be conquered, the results can be extraordinary and terrifying. At just 20 years old, Alexander became king. Within weeks, he crushed rebellions, executed rivals, and destroyed entire cities to secure his rule. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a message. Alexander understood something early in his life. Fear travels faster than armies, and he used that truth relentlessly. What followed was one of the most daring military campaigns in human history. Alexander led his forces across unfamiliar terrain, facing enemies who outnumbered him 2-1, sometimes 3-1. He fought on riverbanks, in narrow mountain passes, and on vast open plains. He adapted faster than his enemies could respond. He attacked when others would retreat. He charged when others would hesitate. And again, he won. But conquest came at a cost. As the years passed, Alexander changed. The brilliant general became a demanding ruler. The charismatic leader became unpredictable. Friends became enemies. Trust gave way to paranoia. He began to see himself not just as a king, but as something more, something divine. Then, in the ancient city of Babylon, with his empire stretching farther than any before it, Alexander fell ill. Within days, the strongest man in the known world could no longer stand. Within less than 2 weeks, he was dead. No clear cause, no clear answers. Poison, disease, a body pushed beyond human limits. Historians still argue, and the truth may never be known. Alexander's death did not end his story. It began a new one. An empire without a ruler, generals turning on each other, a world reshaped by one man's ambition. Greek culture spread across continents. New cities were founded. New ideas were born. The ancient world was never the same again. This is not just the story of conquest. It is the story of ambition without limits, of brilliance paired with obsession, of a man who conquered the world, but never had time to rule it. And to understand how Alexander became this man, we must go back to the very beginning, to his childhood, to his family, and to the dangerous ideas that shaped his destiny. Alexander the Great was born in 356 BCE in the kingdom of Macedon, a land both powerful and unstable. This was not a peaceful royal household. It was a court filled with ambition, rivalry, fear, and constant plotting. From the moment Alexander was born, he stood at the center of competing forces that would shape his mind for the rest of his life. Alexander's mother was Olympias, a woman described by ancient sources as intelligent, intense, and deeply religious. Olympias believed strongly in divine signs and destiny. She surrounded herself with rituals, symbols, and myths. From a very early age, Alexander was told stories that blurred the line between history and legend. Olympias claimed that Alexander's true father was not merely human. According to some accounts, she suggested that Zeus himself, king of the gods, had played a role in his conception. Whether Alexander believed this literally or symbolically, the idea mattered. A child raised to believe he is chosen by the gods does not grow up seeing limits the way others do. If Olympias gave Alexander his sense of destiny, his father taught him power. Alexander's father was Philip II of Macedon, one of the most formidable rulers of his age. Philip was not a romantic hero. He was a strategist. He transformed Macedon from a fractured kingdom into a dominant military power. He reformed the army, introduced the long Macedonian spear, the sarissa, and drilled his soldiers relentlessly. War was not an abstract idea in Alexander's childhood. It was daily reality. As a boy, Alexander watched his father return from campaigns, sometimes wounded, often victorious. He saw power rewarded. He saw weakness punished. The relationship between Philip and Olympias was volatile. Political marriages were common, and Philip took multiple wives to secure alliances. Each new marriage threatened Alexander's position as heir to the throne. Court intrigue followed, whispers of betrayal, rumors of replacement. Alexander grew up knowing that his future was never guaranteed. This environment sharpened him early. He learned to observe people closely, to sense danger, to assert himself when challenged. At a young age, Alexander was already learning that survival at court required strength, not just of body, but of will. One story from Alexander's youth became legendary even in his own lifetime. A powerful horse, later named Bucephalus, was brought to the Macedonian court. No one could ride it. The animal was violent, uncontrollable. While grown men failed, the young Alexander noticed something simple. The horse was afraid of its own shadow. Alexander turned the horse toward the sun, removed the fear, and rode it successfully. The lesson mattered more than the act. Alexander did not see problems as others did. He looked for causes beneath the surface. Philip, watching his son, is said to have remarked that Macedon was too small for him. When Alexander reached his teenage years, Philip made a decision that would shape history. He hired Aristotle, one of the greatest thinkers of the ancient world, to tutor his son. Aristotle taught Alexander more than reading and writing. He taught him philosophy, ethics, politics, science, geography, and the works of Homer. Alexander became especially attached to the Iliad. He saw himself reflected in Achilles, a warrior who chose glory over a long, quiet life. This idea would stay with him forever. Aristotle also gave Alexander something else: curiosity. Alexander did not just want to conquer lands. He wanted to understand them, their customs, their people, their gods. This blend, philosophy paired with force, made Alexander different from other warlords. At just 16 years old, Alexander was left in charge of Macedon while Philip campaigned elsewhere. During this time, a local tribe rebelled. Alexander did not hesitate. He crushed the revolt, destroyed the settlement, and founded a new city in its place. He named it after himself. It was a clear signal. Alexander was not waiting patiently for power. He was practicing for it. By his late teens, Alexander had already experienced court politics, military command, philosophical education, and constant pressure to prove himself. He admired his father, but he also competed with him. Philip was winning battles. Philip was becoming legendary. Alexander feared being remembered as lesser. This fear of being outshined, of being forgotten, became a powerful engine. Alexander's childhood was not gentle. It was forged in tension, shaped by belief, and hardened by violence. By the time he reached adulthood, he was already convinced of one thing: he was meant for greatness, and the world would either make room for him or be forced to. In the year 336 BCE, everything changed in a single moment. The king of Macedon, Philip II of Macedon, was assassinated during a public celebration. He was surrounded by nobles, soldiers, and allies when a lone bodyguard struck him down. The murder was sudden, public, and devastating. Within moments, the most powerful man in Greece was dead, and his empire stood exposed. Philip's death created a vacuum. Macedon was strong, but it was also fragile. The kingdom depended heavily on Philip's authority, his personal alliances, and his reputation for fear. Now, that authority was gone. And the new king was only 20 years old. His name was Alexander the Great. To many in Greece, Alexander did not look like a ruler. He looked like an opportunity. Alexander's first danger came not from foreign enemies, but from within his own court. Macedonian politics were ruthless. Rival claimants, half-brothers and powerful nobles, all had reasons to challenge a young king. Alexander acted immediately. He ordered the execution of rivals who posed a threat to his rule. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it sent a clear message. The boy was gone. A king had taken his place. News of Philip's death spread quickly. Across Greece, city-states that had been forced into alliance by Philip's power began to rebel. Athens hesitated. Others prepared to break away. The most dangerous challenge came from Thebes, a city with a long military tradition and a history of resistance. Many believed Alexander would negotiate. Instead, he marched. Alexander moved south with astonishing speed. His army appeared before Thebes before many even believed the reports. When the city resisted, Alexander made a decision that would define his reputation. Thebes was destroyed. Its defenses were crushed. Large parts of the city were burned. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Only temples and the house of a famous poet were spared. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would not be debated. It would be erased. The destruction of Thebes shocked Greece. Athens, watching carefully, quickly backed down. Other cities followed. Alexander did not need to fight them all. Fear traveled faster than his army. By the age of 20, Alexander had done what many older rulers could not. He secured absolute authority through decisive action. With Greece subdued, Alexander turned to the ambition that his father had never lived to complete. Philip II had planned an invasion of Persia, the greatest empire in the known world. For decades, the Persians had loomed as both enemy and legend. Now, the plan passed to Alexander. But this was no symbolic inheritance. It was a gamble. Persia had vast armies, endless wealth, generations of power. Alexander had youth, speed, and a highly trained but limited force. Many expected him to delay. He did not. Before marching east, Alexander addressed his soldiers. Many of them had fought under Philip. Some had known Alexander since childhood. He did not present himself as a distant king. He stood among them. He reminded them of shared victories, of Macedon's strength, of the glory that awaited beyond the Aegean. The army accepted him, not just as Philip's son, but as their leader. That loyalty would become one of Alexander's greatest weapons. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed into Asia Minor. This was more than a military move. It was a declaration. Once he stepped onto Persian soil, there could be no retreat without disgrace. He was no longer a young king securing his throne. He was now a challenger to empire itself. At 20 years old, Alexander had eliminated his rivals, terrified Greece into submission, and committed himself to a war that no one had ever won. The world was about to discover whether his confidence was genius or madness. By the time Alexander the Great had secured the throne of Macedon, his power rested on force. But force alone was not enough. Alexander understood something that many rulers never learn. An empire cannot be built while the ground behind you remains unstable. Before turning east toward Persia, Alexander needed certainty. Certainty that Greece would not rise against him. Certainty that no enemy would strike his homeland in his absence. And certainty that his invasion would be seen not as reckless ambition, but as destiny fulfilled. Although Alexander had crushed Thebes and intimidated the Greek city-states into submission, resentment did not disappear. Athens still remembered its independence. Sparta still refused to fully submit. Other cities obeyed out of fear, not loyalty. Greek unity had always been fragile. Alexander knew that rebellion did not need strength, only opportunity. An opportunity came when rulers left home. Rather than ruling Greece through constant military presence, Alexander relied on a political structure inherited from his father, the League of Corinth. Officially, the League was a defensive alliance, a union of Greek states sworn to peace with one another. In reality, it was Macedonian dominance made legal. Alexander was named hegemon, the supreme commander of all Greek forces. Member states agreed to supply troops, contribute ships, recognize Alexander's leadership, and never rebel against Macedon. In return, they were allowed to govern themselves internally. This arrangement created the illusion of Greek unity. An illusion was powerful. Alexander did not present the invasion of Persia as a Macedonian war. He framed it as a Greek war of revenge. More than a century earlier, Persian armies had invaded Greece, burning temples, sacking cities, and humiliating Athens. Those memories still mattered. Alexander positioned himself as the man chosen to finish an ancient conflict. Not to conquer Asia, but to punish Persia. This narrative was critical. It transformed Alexander from aggressor into champion of Greek history. Before leaving Europe, Alexander addressed one final concern. To the north of Macedon, tribes in Thrace and Illyria had a long history of rebellion. Leaving them unchecked would invite disaster. Alexander launched swift campaigns against them. The fighting was hard, often in mountainous terrain, but the results were decisive. By the time Alexander returned south, every border behind him was secure. There would be no surprises, no rear attacks, no distractions. The invasion of Persia required precision. Alexander did not take the entire Macedonian army. He chose carefully. Veterans who had fought under Philip, elite cavalry units, the core of the phalanx, men trained to move, fight, and die together. This was not an army of numbers. It was an army of quality. One of Alexander's most important decisions was to travel light. Rather than relying on massive supply trains, he chose speed. His army would live off the land when possible, capture enemy resources, move faster than Persian commanders could react. This strategy was dangerous, but Alexander believed hesitation was more dangerous than hunger. Speed would become his greatest weapon. Alexander made another deliberate choice. He refused to separate himself from his men. He marched beside them, ate the same food, endured the same heat, rain, and exhaustion. This was not accidental. Alexander knew loyalty could not be commanded. It had to be earned. His soldiers did not see him as a distant king. They saw him as one of them. That bond would carry them across thousands of miles. Before crossing into Asia, Alexander made a detour. He traveled to Troy. To most, Troy was a ruin. To Alexander, it was sacred ground. He had grown up with Homer's Iliad. Achilles was not just a hero to him, he was a model. At Troy, Alexander performed sacrifices. He honored Achilles' tomb. He is said to have crowned himself with a garland. This was not superstition. It was symbolism. By visiting Troy, Alexander was doing something intentional. He was linking his campaign to the greatest war in Greek memory. He was telling his soldiers and himself that this invasion was part of a story older than any one man. He was not simply marching into Asia, he was stepping into legend. Ancient accounts claim Alexander took ancient weapons from Troy, possibly symbolic armor associated with heroes of myth. Whether this happened literally matters less than what it represented. Alexander believed belief itself was a weapon. If his army believed they were part of destiny, they would endure anything. With preparations complete, the army assembled along the Aegean coast. Ships waited. Men checked weapons. Officers issued final instructions. Behind them lay Greece, their homes, families, and past lives. Ahead lay Asia, unknown, vast, and hostile. This was the final moment, where turning back was possible. Alexander did not pause long. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander the Great reached the edge of Europe. Ahead of him lay Asia Minor, and beyond it, the vast territory of the Persian Empire. Between Alexander and the greatest prize in the known world stood distance, logistics, unfamiliar terrain, and an enemy with resources far beyond his own. This was not a cautious campaign. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. Alexander began by crossing the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Ancient sources describe the crossing as deliberate and symbolic. Alexander is said to have cast a spear into Asian soil, declaring the land won by the spear. Whether literal or symbolic, the message was clear. There would be no turning back. Alexander's invading force numbered roughly 35,000 to 40,000 men. It was a professional army, disciplined, experienced, and loyal, but small by imperial standards. The Persian Empire, ruled by Darius III, could draw on hundreds of thousands of troops spread across its territories. Persia also had wealth, established supply networks, and local allies. On paper, Alexander should not have lasted a year. Alexander understood something critical. He could not defeat Persia by fighting the way Persia fought. Instead, he focused on speed, initiative, and psychological dominance. Rather than wait to be surrounded, he advanced quickly along the coast of Asia Minor. This protected his supply lines and denied the Persians control of the sea. Every move was calculated. Asia Minor was not empty territory. It was filled with Greek cities that had lived under Persian rule for generations. Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In city after city, he restored local governments and removed Persian officials. This approach earned him support and denied Persia manpower. It was conquest through politics as much as through force. The Persian response came quickly. Near the Battle of the Granicus, Persian satraps gathered their forces to block Alexander's advance. They chose strong ground, a riverbank that forced attackers to fight uphill through water. Many of Alexander's advisors urged caution. They wanted to wait. Alexander did not. Alexander ordered an immediate attack. The Macedonian cavalry charged across the river under heavy missile fire. It was a dangerous move. Ancient accounts describe Alexander fighting personally at the front, nearly being killed when a Persian noble struck at his head. He survived only because a companion intervened. The risk was immense, but the result was decisive. Once the Macedonian phalanx gained footing, its long spears broke Persian formations. Persian cavalry collapsed. Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia were surrounded and destroyed. The battle ended quickly and decisively. Alexander had won his first major engagement against Persian forces. The psychological impact was enormous. After the Granicus, Western Asia Minor began to fall rapidly. Cities opened their gates. Persian authority weakened. The myth of Persian invincibility, carefully maintained for centuries, had been shattered in a single battle. Alexander did not pause. He pressed forward relentlessly. Speed became his greatest weapon. Unlike many conquerors, Alexander did not simply move on after victory. He reorganized administrations, left garrisons, collected resources. He understood that territory meant nothing without stability behind the front lines. This balance between aggression and control was rare and critical. By the end of his first campaign season in Asia, Alexander was no longer seen as a reckless young king. He was now a proven threat. Persian commanders began to realize that this war would not be won through local resistance alone. The empire itself would have to respond. That response would come soon. As Alexander moved deeper into Persian territory, one truth became unavoidable. The king of Persia could no longer ignore him. A direct confrontation between two rulers, two visions of power, was approaching. And when it came, the fate of an empire would hang in the balance. By late 333 BCE, the war had changed. What began as a daring invasion was now an existential threat to the Persian Empire itself. The king of Persia, Darius III, could no longer rely on regional commanders or local defenses. He would have to face Alexander the Great himself, and when he did, the outcome would define the future of the ancient world. The two armies met near the Mediterranean coast, at a narrow plain beside a river, a place later known as the Battle of Issus. Darius arrived with overwhelming numbers. Ancient sources exaggerate the size of his army, but it was clearly far larger than Alexander's force. Normally, this advantage would have been decisive, but terrain mattered. The narrow battlefield prevented Persia from using its numbers effectively. Once again, Alexander had chosen the ground. Alexander positioned his elite cavalry on the right flank and personally led the charge. His strategy was simple, but risky. Strike directly at the Persian center, where Darius stood. The Macedonian phalanx held the line, absorbing pressure, while Alexander broke through. When Darius saw the Macedonian cavalry approaching, he panicked. The Persian king turned his chariot and fled the battlefield. The moment Darius retreated, the Persian army collapsed. Victory followed swiftly. Darius escaped, but he left behind something far more damaging than defeat. His family, his mother, wife, and children were captured by Alexander's forces. Alexander treated them with respect, ensuring their safety and honor. This decision was strategic as well as personal. It sent a powerful message. Alexander was not a barbarian conqueror. He was presenting himself as a legitimate ruler of Asia. After Issus, Alexander moved south along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Most cities surrendered. They had seen what resistance cost. One city, however, refused. That city was Tyre. Tyre was a heavily fortified island city, protected by massive walls and the sea itself. Alexander demanded entry. The Tyrians refused. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient history. Alexander ordered the construction of a massive causeway, a road built stone by stone across the sea to reach the island. The work took months. Tyrian ships attacked, storms damaged the structure, men died. Alexander persisted. When Tyre finally fell in 332 BCE, Alexander ordered severe punishment. Thousands were killed. Many were enslaved. The city was devastated. This was not a strategic necessity alone. It was a warning. Alexander would be merciful or merciless, depending on resistance. After Tyre, Egypt opened its gates without a fight. Persian rule was deeply unpopular there, and Alexander was welcomed as a liberator. he was crowned pharaoh, adopted into Egyptian tradition, and founded a new city, Alexandria, destined to become one of the greatest cities in history. Here, Alexander began to see himself not just as a Macedonian king, but as a ruler of many worlds. In 331 BCE, the final confrontation arrived. The armies met on an open plain near Battle of Gaugamela. This time, Darius had prepared carefully. He chose flat ground to maximize his numerical advantage. He brought cavalry, infantry, and even scythed chariots. This was Persia's last stand. Alexander studied the battlefield carefully. As the battle began, he maneuvered his forces diagonally, stretching the Persian line. When a gap appeared, Alexander struck. Once again, he aimed directly at Darius. And once again, the Persian king fled. The empire's center collapsed. The battle was over. With the Persian army broken, Alexander marched into the heart of the empire. Cities surrendered without resistance. Treasuries fell into his hands. Finally, he reached Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia. There, in a moment still debated by historians, the royal palace was burned. Some say it was accidental. Others believe it was deliberate, an act of revenge for earlier Persian invasions of Greece. Whatever the reason, the message was clear. The Persian Empire was finished. After Gaugamela and Persepolis, Alexander was no longer a challenger. He was emperor of the largest realm the world had yet seen. But victory brought new problems. The war was not truly over. Darius was still alive. The empire was vast, and Alexander himself was changing. Power was beginning to reshape the man who wielded it. In the next section, Alexander will push beyond Persia into Central Asia and India. There, he will face not just enemies, but exhaustion, rebellion, and the limits of human ambition. By 330 BCE, the Persian Empire had effectively fallen. Its capitals were taken, its armies defeated. Its king, Darius III, was dead, betrayed and murdered by his own men while fleeing east. For most conquerors, this would have been the end. For Alexander the Great, it was only another beginning. Alexander did not stop when the empire ended. Instead of returning home, he turned his army eastward, toward lands few Greeks had ever seen. Central Asia was not a single enemy. It was a vast region of mountains, deserts, and steppe, inhabited by fiercely independent peoples who did not surrender easily. Here, Alexander faced a new kind of war. No grand battles, no decisive confrontations, only ambushes, raids, endless resistance. In regions like Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander fought guerrilla warfare. Enemies vanished into terrain, reappeared without warning, refused open battle. The campaign dragged on for years. Casualties mounted. Frustration grew. Alexander responded with brutality, destroying settlements, executing resistance leaders, and deporting populations. This was not the war of legends. It was slow, exhausting, and unforgiving. During this period, Alexander began to change noticeably. He adopted elements of Persian dress and court ceremony. He demanded forms of respect unfamiliar to Macedonians, including gestures associated with divine kingship. Many of his closest companions were uncomfortable. Some openly resisted. Alexander did not tolerate defiance easily. One of the most tragic moments of this phase was the killing of Clytus the Black, a trusted officer who had once saved Alexander's life in battle. During a drunken argument, Clytus criticized Alexander's growing arrogance and his adoption of Persian customs. Alexander, enraged, killed him with his own hands. The moment haunted him. Ancient sources describe Alexander collapsing in grief afterward, locking himself away for days. It was a sign that the man who conquered empires was no longer fully in control of himself. Still, Alexander pushed on. By 326 BCE, his army reached the fringes of the Indian subcontinent. Here, they encountered new landscapes, lush plains, wide rivers, and a monsoon climate unlike anything they had known. They also encountered new weapons, war elephants. Alexander's greatest challenge in India came against King Porus, who commanded a powerful army supported by elephants. The battle took place near the Hydaspes River. Alexander used deception, crossing the river upstream during a storm to surprise Porus. The fighting was brutal. The elephants caused chaos. Men and horses were crushed. But discipline prevailed. Alexander won. After the battle, Alexander asked Porus how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, "Like a king." Alexander respected the answer. He allowed Porus to rule his territory as a vassal. This moment reflected a pattern. Alexander admired strength, especially when it mirrored his own. Beyond the Hydaspes lay even more land, more kingdoms, more unknown rivers. Alexander wanted to continue. His soldiers did not. They had marched for nearly a decade. They were thousands of miles from home. They faced endless rain, disease, and unfamiliar enemies. At the Hyphasis River, the army refused to go farther. This was unprecedented. Alexander argued, pleaded, raged, but the decision stood. For the first time in his life, Alexander was forced to accept a limit. The return journey was worse than the advance. Part of the army was sent by sea. Alexander led the rest through the Gedrosian Desert, one of the harshest regions in the ancient world. Heat, lack of water, starvation, thousands died without battle. Many historians believe this march was Alexander's greatest mistake. When Alexander finally emerged from the east, he was still king, still undefeated, but something had shifted. His army was weary, his companions were fewer, and Alexander himself seemed restless, driven, yet uncertain. He had reached the edge of the known world and discovered that, even for him, the world had an edge. In the next section, we will step away from the battles and examine the man himself, his personality, his contradictions, and the flaws that grew alongside his power. By the time Alexander the Great returned from India, he was no longer simply a conqueror. He was a ruler of peoples who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived by customs unfamiliar to Macedonia. The empire he commanded stretched farther than any one man could easily understand. And as Alexander's power expanded, so did the complexity of the man himself. Ancient sources describe Alexander as intensely driven and restless. He slept little. He planned constantly. He read obsessively, especially the works of Homer. Alexander did not see conquest as random violence. He saw it as purpose. He believed his life had meaning only if it was remembered. This obsession with legacy would define nearly every decision he made. As Alexander ruled deeper into Asia, he began adopting Persian customs. He wore elements of Persian royal dress. He allowed himself to be addressed with titles previously reserved for Persian kings. Most controversially, he experimented with proskynesis, a form of bowing or prostration used in Persian court culture to show respect to divine or semi-divine rulers. To Persians, this was normal. To Macedonians, it was unacceptable. They did not worship kings. They followed them. Alexander's closest companions had marched with him since Greece. They had shared danger, hunger, and victory. But now, they felt a distance growing. Some believed Alexander was abandoning his roots. Others feared he no longer saw himself as human. Resistance followed. Quiet at first, then open. One of Alexander's most experienced generals was Parmenion. Parmenion had served Alexander's father and played a crucial role in early victories. When Alexander uncovered a suspected conspiracy involving Parmenion's son, he acted swiftly. Without a trial, Parmenion was executed. Whether he was guilty remains debated. What mattered was the message. Experience and loyalty no longer guaranteed safety. Alexander drank heavily, as did many Macedonian nobles. But ancient writers suggest that Alexander's drinking worsened over time. Alcohol amplified his temper. Arguments escalated quickly. Words turned into violence. The killing of Clytus the Black, already described earlier, was not an isolated emotional lapse. It was a symptom. Alexander was under constant pressure from enemies, from his own legend, and from the impossible expectations he had placed upon himself. Alexander was capable of extreme cruelty. The destruction of Thebes, the punishment of Tyre, the massacres in Central Asia. Yet he was also capable of mercy. He spared defeated kings. He honored bravery in enemies. He protected scholars, priests, and artists. These contradictions puzzled even his contemporaries. Alexander did not rule by one principle. He ruled by instinct. Despite the violence, Alexander did not see his empire as merely Macedonian. He encouraged intermarriage between his officers and local women. He adopted local administrators. He founded cities populated by mixed cultures. In his mind, he was not destroying civilizations, he was blending them. This idea of a connected world, sharing culture and knowledge, was revolutionary. But it also alienated many Macedonians who saw their identity slipping away. As Alexander's authority grew absolute, his circle grew smaller. Trusted advisors were gone, killed, executed, or emotionally distant. Few people dared to speak honestly to him. Fewer still could challenge him. Alexander stood at the center of a vast empire, surrounded by power, and increasingly alone. By his early 30s, Alexander had achieved everything he once dreamed of. But the price was heavy. His health was declining. His temper was volatile. His confidence sometimes bordered on delusion. The boy raised to believe he was chosen by the gods had become a man who no longer knew where the human ended and the legend began. In the next and final chapter of his life, that fragile balance would collapse. In the city of Babylon, Alexander would fall ill, and within days, the greatest conqueror of the ancient world would be dead, leaving behind a mystery that has endured for more than 2,000 years. In 323 BCE, the center of the world was Babylon. It was here, in a city of canals, temples, and palaces, that Alexander the Great planned his next move. He was only 32 years old. His empire stretched from Greece to the edges of India. No enemy remained strong enough to challenge him directly. And yet, Alexander would never leave Babylon alive. Alexander chose Babylon carefully. It sat at the crossroads of civilizations, Greek, Persian, Mesopotamian. From here, he planned new campaigns, a naval expedition into Arabia, the expansion of trade routes, the administrative consolidation of his empire. Despite years of exhaustion, Alexander appeared restless, not finished. Those close to him noted ambition still burning. But something was about to change. Ancient sources agree on one thing. Alexander fell ill suddenly. After attending a banquet and drinking heavily, he developed a fever. At first, it seemed ordinary. Fevers were common in the ancient world. Soldiers pushed through them regularly. Alexander did the same, but this illness did not pass. Over the next several days, the fever intensified. Alexander grew weaker, movement became painful. Yet he continued issuing orders from his bed. As days passed, his voice grew faint. Eventually, he could no longer speak at all. According to ancient writers, his soldiers were allowed to pass by his bed, one by one, to see their king for the last time. Alexander reportedly acknowledged them silently, with his eyes. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, Alexander died. There was no dramatic final speech, no declaration of an heir. When asked who should inherit the empire, Alexander is said to have whispered, "To the strongest." Whether this was said at all remains debated, but the chaos that followed suggests no clear succession plan existed. The cause of Alexander's death remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Ancient sources offer no definitive answer. Modern historians and doctors have proposed several theories. Poison was the most popular explanation among Alexander's contemporaries. He had many enemies. Disgruntled officers threatened nobles, political rivals. However, poison has problems as an explanation. Most ancient poisons acted quickly. Alexander's illness lasted nearly 2 weeks. No clear suspect was ever identified. Many scholars favour natural causes. Possible illnesses include malaria, typhoid fever, pneumonia, complications from old wounds. Babylon's environment, with stagnant water and heat, was ideal for disease. Alexander's body was already weakened by years of injury, stress, and alcohol. Some historians believe Alexander simply pushed himself too far. By age 32, he had survived countless battles, suffered serious wounds, endured extreme climates, lived under constant pressure. The illness may not have been extraordinary. The life he lived was. Alexander's death triggered immediate instability. There was no adult heir, no agreed successor. His generals, the Diadochi, turned on one another. What followed were decades of war, division, and betrayal. Alexander's empire shattered, but his influence did not. Though the empire fell apart, Alexander changed the world permanently. Greek language and culture spread across continents. Cities bearing his name flourished. Ideas moved faster than armies ever could. The Hellenistic world was born. Rome would later inherit it. So would much of Western civilization. Alexander spent his life chasing greatness. He conquered everything he saw. But in the end, he could not conquer time, or the limits of the human body. His story endures not because he ruled long, but because he lived intensely. Few lives have burned so brightly, or ended so suddenly. When Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, the world did not pause. It fractured. The empire he had carved out through relentless motion, through speed, courage, fear, and vision, had been held together by one thing above all else: Alexander himself. Without him, the unity vanished almost immediately. But what replaced it was not a return to the old world. It was something entirely new. Alexander left behind no clear successor. His son was unborn. His half-brother was unfit to rule. Power fell instead to his generals, men hardened by decades of war, each commanding loyalty from seasoned armies. They became known as the Diadochi. At first they claimed to rule in Alexander's name, but ambition does not wait. Within months, alliances collapsed. Armies marched against former comrades. The empire dissolved into decades of brutal conflict. The wars of the Diadochi reshaped the map of the ancient world. Yet even as Alexander's political empire fell apart, his deeper legacy was only beginning. From the ruins of Alexander's empire emerged a new cultural age, the Hellenistic world. This was not a single empire, but a shared civilization. Greek language spread across 3 continents. Greek ideas travelled along trade routes Alexander had opened. Greek art, architecture, philosophy, and science mixed with the local traditions from Egypt, Persia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Never before had so many cultures been connected so quickly and so deeply. This was not planned in detail by Alexander, but it was made possible by him. Alexander founded or inspired the founding of dozens of cities. Many bore his name. The most famous was Alexandria. Located on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, Alexandria became more than a city. It became an idea, a place where scholars from different cultures met, where texts were copied, debated, preserved, where science, medicine, astronomy, and mathematics advanced. The famous Library of Alexandria, though built after Alexander's death, embodied his unintended legacy, knowledge without borders. Before Alexander, the ancient world was fragmented. Cultures developed largely in isolation. Ideas moved slowly. After Alexander, that changed. Philosophers travelled. Doctors compared methods. Engineers borrowed techniques from foreign lands. Greek became the language of trade, diplomacy, and learning. Even those who resisted Macedonian rule found themselves living in a world Alexander had reshaped. Alexander never faced Rome. But Rome would study him obsessively. Roman generals read accounts of his campaigns. They analysed his tactics. They compared themselves to him. Julius Caesar is said to have wept when he realised that Alexander had conquered the world by an age when Caesar had achieved little. Roman emperors would later adopt Greek culture, Greek education, and Greek philosophy, all spread initially through Alexander's conquests. Through Rome, Alexander's influence reached Europe. Through Europe, it reached the modern world. Alexander is often called the Great. But what does that mean? He was undefeated in battle. He commanded loyalty across cultures. He changed the course of history, but he also destroyed cities. He displaced populations. He ruled through fear as often as mercy. Thousands died following his ambition. Was greatness measured in territory or in impact? Alexander forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about history, that the same qualities which create progress can also cause immense suffering. Alexander believed in something rare for his age, that people of different cultures could exist within a shared world. He encouraged intermarriage. He adopted foreign customs. He promoted local elites. In many ways, his vision resembled a global society. Yet he was also a product of his time, a warrior king in an age of violence. His empire expanded through bloodshed. His dream of unity rested on conquest. The contradiction was never resolved. Alexander lived intensely. He marched farther than any general before him. He slept less. He pushed harder. He demanded more from himself and others. By the time he died at 32, his body was exhausted. His mind was burdened by pressure and expectation. He had no time to slow down, no chance to reflect. History remembers his rise. It rarely lingers on what that life cost him. Over centuries, Alexander became more than a man. He became myth. Stories exaggerated his courage. Legends softened his brutality. Different cultures reshaped him into what they needed. To Greeks, he was a hero. To Persians, a conqueror. To later rulers, a model to imitate. To historians, an endless debate. The truth lies somewhere in between. More than 2,000 years later, Alexander the Great is still studied. Not because his empire survived. It didn't. But because the world that followed him was fundamentally different from the one before. He accelerated history. He connected civilizations. He proved how much one individual, for better or worse, can change the course of humanity. Alexander once chased the edge of the world and found that the world kept expanding. In the end, he conquered more land than any man before him. But his greatest conquest was not territory, it was transformation. The ancient world never returned to what it had been. And in that sense, Alexander the Great never truly died. Empires fall, cities fade, borders change, but ideas endure. Alexander's empire vanished within a generation. His legacy still shapes the world we live in. And perhaps that is the truest measure of greatness.